Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the AP Environmental Science Aquatic Ecosystems Notes. Most of the Earth is covered in water. You can see the Pacific Ocean on the left there, and then the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean on the right here. Most of the northern hemisphere is covered in land, but most of the southern hemisphere is actually covered in water. So there's very different dynamics in the northern and the southern hemisphere because of the location of water. And the aquatic world does include more than just the oceans, of course. You have many major rivers and streams, and then you also have coastal areas as well. So when we categorize aquatic zones, we look at those that have salt and those that don't. So the saltwater or marine ecosystems includes not just the oceans, but also estuaries, coastlines, marshes, and mangrove swamps. Freshwater aquatic life zones include the things that we're closest to here in Ohio, lakes and ponds, streams and rivers, and any inland wetlands. So like Highlands Park has an inland wetland, and that all has freshwater, water that doesn't have salt in it. There are several factors that are going to determine the type of biodiversity you find in an aquatic system. Temperature is a huge one. Certain types of life prefer the warmer temperatures. Dissolved oxygen is basically going to determine how large of organisms you can have in an area. The availability of food, the availability of light, you've got to be able to have photosynthesis in order to form the base of your food chain and those producers. And then nutrients available for those plants to also grow. And that's kind of tricky when it comes to the ocean in particular, because while you might get nutrients on the surface for a short period of time, a lot of the nutrients actually sink to the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of any body of water, really. It gradually moves its way down to the bottom. So it can be challenging for things on the surface to grow without adequate nutrients. Some of the organisms we might find in an aquatic ecosystem include plankton. So these are just free floating. They're very tiny organisms, and we'll talk about a few different types of plankton. Phytoplankton are the ones that take the energy from the sun and turn it into their own food. So these are your producers. And they form the base of the aquatic food web. They are found in the euphotic zone, which we'll talk more about in a few slides here. Zooplankton, think zoo, think of animal. These are actually animals. They're consumers that feed on the phytoplankton. And those zooplankton are eaten by smaller fish, so they're primary consumers that get eaten by larger animals. And then ultraplankton is a term that was new to me last year when I saw these notes, but it is a really tiny type of plankton, and it actually produces about 70% of the food for the oceans. It's 70% of the primary productivity on the ocean's surface. There are special names for different types of ocean life based mostly on their behaviors or where they're located. Nekton are your strong swimmers like fish, turtles, or whales. Benthos, these are your bottom dwellers. So this could include barnacles and oysters, sponges, worms, clams, crawfish, and sea stars. I'll leave the slide up here for a moment for you to copy that. Some pretty cool pictures of coral on that right there, and sea star. Not a starfish, it's a sea star. Decomposers, these are similar to decomposers on land, where they break down organic compounds that are in the dead bodies and waste of other aquatic organisms. And a lot of these decomposers are bacteria, just like they are in land. So they're an important part of aquatic ecosystems, in addition to what we see on land as well. Here we are at our first pit stop. Where does most of the food in an aquatic ecosystem exist, and why? So think of the base of your food chain and what you need to create that base of your food chain. And then where do most of the nutrients exist? It gets back to what I was saying about kind of the challenge for ocean ecosystems in particular, or other deep water ecosystems. Pause the video while you answer the question. So let's talk a little bit more about marine ecosystems, and then we'll take a look at freshwater ecosystems. Again, marine just means ocean. So anytime you see the word marine, you're referring to the ocean. Marine ecosystems are further divided into categories, into certain zones. The coastal or intertidal zone is close to the continent, and this is actually where you will find most of the life forms. The greatest biodiversity is found in the intertidal zone. Estuaries and coastal wetlands are other structures you might see near the coast, and they also are important in helping to get rid of a lot of the pollution that humans tend to send out to the sea. They're kind of a borderline between the ocean and the land. And then you have pelagic or the open sea zone. So this is what we consider the ocean when we look at it in our very human oriented things. It's actually called the pelagic zone. And there's three different layers of that. We're going to look at that in a picture here in a few slides. There are limiting factors in the ocean. So again, remember, limiting factors are things that limit the growth of a population. So temperature is one. During certain times of year, you might see organisms migrating out of the ocean area that they are in due to anything from pollution or temperature change. So animals like a particular temperature just like we do. Turbidity is a term that you will need to know. You do see that on the AP exam. Turbidity is the cloudiness of the water. So usually after it rains, the river like Alum Creek will get really like muddy looking and brown and you can't see through to the bottom. That's called turbidity. So it's just cloudiness, and it's often caused by precipitation that can cloud the water. Other things can cloud it as well. Pollution is a good example. The access to sunlight is the important thing for those producers, for the base of the food chain. And that is called, that top layer where the sunlight comes in is called the euphotic zone. Dissolved oxygen is important for most fish, and it happens to be a problem in the Gulf of Mexico. Every summer, you end up with a lot of dead fish because the dissolved oxygen is taken away through eutrophication, which we'll talk about in another few slides. So dissolved oxygen is especially important for larger organisms. Available nutrients are oftentimes, like I said, at the bottom of the ocean or at the bottom of a body of water. So they're best found in shallow water. If it's a deep area, there's a process called upwelling that is really important, and it causes, it's like deep water ocean currents, and it causes cold water and nutrients to rise to the top. It's actually something that happens, I believe it's during the El Nino season mostly, or El Nino interacts with it. So the upwelling brings nutrients to the surface, and then those producers can use those nutrients to make sugars, to make the cells and to make their bodies. In the open ocean, there are zones based on how much light the area gets. So the euphotic zone I just mentioned in the last slide, that is a brightly lit surface area. And the nutrient levels might be low, especially nutrients will come out to the ocean and they'll be up there for a little bit, but then they gradually float down to the bottom. There is a lot of dissolved oxygen there though, and photosynthetic activity takes place there with the amount of nutrients that are available. The bathyal zone is a dimly lit middle layer. So there's no photosynthesis going on there, but you do have zooplankton and fish, and they tend to migrate up to the euphotic zone to feed on the producers at night. The abyssal zone is the abyss, the dark layer at the very bottom, and it's very cold. There's not a lot of oxygen, so there's very little biodiversity found in that abyssal zone. So here's a couple of labels here. Photosynthesis takes place at the top. You call it twilight in the middle, the bathyal zone, and then darkness at the bottom. This is a good picture representing the different layers of the open ocean here, the euphotic zone, bathyal zone, and the abyssal zone. And then you can see up here all sorts of different types of life. There's the greatest biodiversity is found in the intertidal zone, closer to the surface of the continent. So the coastal or intertidal zone is extending from the shoreline where the ocean meets the land and all the way out to the continental shelf. So the continental shelf is really, when we go back to this picture here, it's the area that comes out and then it drops off quickly after that. So all continents have this sort of land that goes under the sea out into the ocean. And as sea levels have gone up and down, that shoreline changes over time. But it goes out into the ocean a bit, and there's a lot more nutrients, a lot more light, and a lot more dissolved oxygen there. So it is a productive area. And that's why we see such high biodiversity in the coastal and intertidal zone. However, it can be threatened by these organisms can be threatened by the sand and the tides moving in and out. So the organisms that live there have had to learn to adapt to that constant changing of moisture to dryness. Crabs can burrow into the sand. Mussels will attach to things, and they can last through dry periods as well. So there's also estuaries and ecotone regions. Excuse me, the estuaries are ecotone regions, the spaces between two biomes. So once again, estuaries are kind of like a transition zone between the land and the open ocean. So those are also very high in biodiversity. Now, the types of organisms that you'll find in coastal areas really depends on the rockiness or the sandiness of that area. Sandy shores are often considered barrier beaches because they act as protective for the inland ecosystems. And so organisms that are living in those areas have to deal with the changes in salinity and moisture changes that come along with water going in and out with the tides. Salinity, again, is the saltiness of the water. So when the tide is out, there's less salt in the area. And when it comes in, there's more salt and moisture. So again, sand dunes act as buffers to protect against storm surges, particularly when there's hurricanes, and they protect the ecosystems further inland. Here is a picture of a rocky beach. Here's the actual picture, and these are some of the life forms that you might find in rocky beach areas. So these organisms have developed specialized niches. You guys can see the bold word down there at the bottom in these rocky beaches. And we'll do a picture of the sandy beach as well. Right here, called a barrier beach, which is really just another name for a sandy beach. So once again, the sand acts as a buffer zone between the open ocean and the ecosystems that are further inland. So it's protecting that area. But you can notice there's a lot of different types of organisms compared to the rocky beach. They're adapted to the conditions at the coastal area where they're located. Now, coastal wetlands and estuaries are really important in terms of primary productivity, but they also provide ecological and economic services. They filter out toxic pollutants, including plant nutrients, sediments, and then toxic mercury and things like that that are released into water. They also reduce storm damage, again, serving as a buffer zone, absorbing the waves and any excess water that's produced by storms or tsunamis. And then they also provide food, habitats, and nursery sites for a lot of aquatic species. So you guys do have a question on your quiz this week related to that. What is the importance of coastal wetlands, and what kind of things are serviced by those coastal wetlands? What kind of things can a community expect to get out of those coastal wetlands? There is a view of an estuary from space. So you can see this is where the ocean meets the river area. So this is the estuary area. So it's kind of a filter zone, if you will. And this picture of one in Georgia also shows there's a kind of a buffer zone between the ocean and the inland waters. Now, coastal wetlands occur at river mouths, at inlets, bays, sounds. Mangrove forest swamps are actually really common in Florida, and then salt marshes, which are saltwater swamps, basically. Here's a salt marsh in Lake Titicaca, Peru. And again, they look like a standard wetland, they just have salt water instead. And then mangrove forests, which, like I said, are common in Florida and other southeastern cities or states, they have a protective root system here. And this is actually maybe familiar to you from the Columbus Zoo. They have a display in the manatee manatee building. So tropical and subtropical regions have these mangrove forests, and you can see just by looking at them how protective they would be if there was a large storm surge coming inland. It would protect the community that lives further inland. So mangroves are very important as a habitat as well. They host a lot of different species. All right, so let's get into our open sea zones. And you'll notice these terms, a lot of them may seem new. The terminology is not super important. What is important for you to know is that there's different types of life and different levels of nutrients and temperatures at different areas within the ocean. So don't get hung up too much on the names of these zones. So this here is showing those different zones that you just saw on the last slide. Again, the intercoastal area, or the area closest to the continent, that's called the neritic zone, that hosts most of the biodiversity and productivity within the ocean. The open sea is then divided into 3 layers based on the depth at which the sunlight reaches and the temperature. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these levels. But once again, don't focus as much on remembering the exact names. It's more about remembering what happens in those zones. So the natritic or neritic zone, this is where the floaters or swimmers are found. So these are your fish, your turtles. The euphotic zone is also there, and euphotic zone, if you remember, is where the light comes in, where photosynthesis takes place. So this is where you'll find the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, and the nectin, those super small organisms that form the base of the food chain. I'll leave that up there for just a moment so you can finish copying that. All right, the next zone is the oceanic. So this is the middle zone. It has colder temperatures and not a lot of sunlight, and that's where a lot of your really large organisms are going to be. They will come up to the surface to get food and oxygen if they need to go up to the surface like whales do, but this is where they normally hang out, in this oceanic zone. And even that has further zones in it. The organisms here depend on marine snow for food. And if you think about any ocean videos that you've seen, underwater videos, you see like the floaty stuff going past the screen. That is marine snow. And what that is just basically the particles that are falling from the surface down to the bottom. So eventually all of those particles, those nutrients, settle towards the bottom. Now they can be brought up by ocean currents. We talked about upwelling in a previous presentation, but upwelling is one way that you get those nutrients up to the top, but eventually they're all going to try to float back down again as marine snow. The abyssal zone, or the abyss, if you want to call it that, that's the very bottom. This one is way further down. You don't have any sunlight. There's very little dissolved oxygen. So the organisms that are there, like this anglerfish, I believe this is an anglerfish, they have a special adaptation to be able to live in this area. They also have a lot of nutrients, though, because again, all of that marine snow, all of the nutrients and materials from the surface eventually float down to the bottom, to the abyss. Here's just another picture showing the different zones and what they're called. Again, the terminology is not as important as just understanding what takes place at different levels of the ocean. And here is a sideways picture. Again, we talked a lot about the biodiversity in the intertidal zone. The neritic zone is where the continent is dropping off. Still have quite a bit of biodiversity there. And then you have the ocean, the open ocean, that gets divided into layers down towards the bottom. Now, your textbook has a good case study about the Chesapeake Bay, an estuary on the East Coast by Maryland and Virginia, I believe. It's the largest estuary in the US, and it's been polluted since the 1960s. The East Coast is a highly population-dense area. The human population has increased substantially, and point and non-point sources have raised the pollution levels. So there are sources that we know exactly where it's coming from, and then the non-point sources are mostly upstream in other areas, even as far north as New York and Pennsylvania. The phosphate and nitrate levels are also very high, and that, again, is coming from especially farm and agriculture further upstream. There's also a lot of excess sediment from runoff, so when it rains and sediments wash into the river, those run downstream, and when you don't have as much vegetation on the edges of those rivers, it increases the amount of sediment that gets through. So vegetation, usually acts as a filter to prevent as much sediment or other pollution from reaching the open ocean. So all of these things have contributed to a very highly polluted situation in the Chesapeake Bay since the 1960s. In this map, you can see here's the bay right here. This is Maryland. This is Virginia right down here. And so all of these rivers, all the way upstream into New York and Pennsylvania, even West Virginia contributes. All of the pollution from those areas finds its way out into this estuary. And what happens is you get these hypoxic zones, or areas with no oxygen. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about that when we talk about eutrophication in a few slides. So the oysters are a keystone species in the Chesapeake Bay, and they've been drastically reduced as a result of all of the pollution. In the 1980s, they started an integrated coastal management system. So this involved both government officials, local leaders, and then environmental groups. And they were trying to clean up this problem in the estuary because oysters are a big species in terms of marketability, and just the bay in general. All sorts of diversity is affected by that pollution. Now, they've spent close to $6 billion as of 2008. They only met 21% of their goals, and the water quality is still very poor. When you think about it, it can be very challenging to try and clean up a bay when the sources of the pollution are further upstream. So you had to have state, local, and even federal government support to help try and reduce some of the causes of pollution in all of these states. So really, you need an interstate effort to be able to make a big difference in an estuary downstream. So they're still working on trying to clean it up, but again, it's a huge problem and it's in a huge populated area. Here we are at our pit stop. I think I mentioned the answer to this first one here. How can phosphate and nitrate levels be a bad thing? And then what is a common anthropogenic source or human-caused source of phosphates and nitrates? That one I definitely mentioned. Pause the video while you take a moment to answer these questions. And actually, we are going to talk a lot more about this high phosphate and nitrate levels in a few slides. So if you don't know the answer, you can come back to this one in a few. Go ahead and pause the video while you answer the question. All right, moving on to our freshwater ecosystems, which make up a much smaller portion of the Earth. The freshwater ecosystems have to have less than 1% of salt concentration to be classified as freshwater. The salt could be NaCl, or actually it can be any solute dissolved into the water. So when rocks erode and put minerals into the water, that's considered salt technically as well. We'll talk about both the standing or lentic bodies, the ponds and lakes, and then we'll also talk about our flowing systems, also called lotic systems, like streams and rivers. So lakes and ponds are divided into zones. That's why I have think zonation. So there's layers to each of the lakes or ponds. The lake has a more stratified layer, so there's lots of different layers in a lake. They are considered natural bodies of standing water. That's why you often hear when a lake has been made by humans, a man-made lake, because lakes in general are supposed to be natural bodies of water. And they have 4 distinct zones. And these are layered in certain times of the year, but then they will mix up and become one big layer during other times of the year. And we'll talk about those different zones and the times that they mix. Ponds, on the other hand, are much shallower. So the sunlight usually goes all the way to the bottom, and there's usually only one zone because you don't have differences in temperature or density that causes them to separate into different layers. So this is showing the division of a lake. And again, you don't need to worry so much about the technical terms of the layers, but just the characteristics of what happens towards the surface, towards the edges, and down below. So in the littoral zone, this is the shallow sunlit waters near the shore. So this is kind of like the intercoastal zone in oceans, but it's on the coast of lakes instead. And this goes all the way out until rooted plants stop growing. So if you've ever been to a lake and sifted out into the water, there's often rooted plants in the water that you might step on or find fish in. So that zone has a very high level of biodiversity because there's plenty of producers for the fish to eat. And then you also have a lot of protection that those fish can get or other organisms can get. So it's a very high level of biodiversity in the littoral zone. The limnetic zone is the surface away from the shore. So this is actually where a lot of the photosynthesis happens in a lake. It's often very small organisms, like algae especially, and this extends down to the depth penetrated by sunlight. So this is the warmer part of the lake. And if you've ever been in a lake and tried to dive down into the lake, it noticeably gets colder as you move down. So this less dense, warmer water is sitting on the top layer, and that's where most photosynthesis takes place. The profundal zone, or the deep open water, doesn't have photosynthesis. It has very low dissolved oxygen, and fish that live down there are adapted to the cooler, darker water. But this is not quite, I believe, the bottom yet. So the benthic zone is the very bottom of the lake, and organisms there tolerate very cool temperatures and low dissolved oxygen. So those that you find at the bottom of the lake, bottom feeders like dogfish and catfish, those are adapted to live in those conditions. So the hypoxic zone in Chesapeake Bay, that no oxygen condition, actually starts when there are too many plant nutrients in a lake. So plant nutrients from the lake's environment affect how much life can happen there. So let's first talk about the word oligotrophic. Oligotrophic is basically a poorly nourished lake. Usually when it's a newly formed lake, whether that's a man-made or a natural lake, and there aren't many plants on it, it's called an oligotrophic lake. Now the word that might sound more familiar is eutrophic. Think of eutrophication, we've mentioned this before, but eutrophic lakes are well nourished. So they have a lot of nutrients in them that allow things to grow. And so this can actually cause excessive plant growth. And this is one of the things that humans contribute to a lot through our use of fertilizers with high nitrogen and phosphorus levels. So eutrophic lakes often turn into algae blooms. And then the algae bloom, when the algae dies, the bacteria that decompose them pull oxygen out of the water to do that decomposition, and then that leaves the lake with low oxygen. So that's the basic cascade of events when you get too many nutrients in the water. So here's a picture of a eutrophic lake right here. Here's a oligotrophic lake here. So not a lot of green or nutrients on the side, so probably not as much life. Our eutrophic lake has too many nutrients, and so the algae just grows out of control. Once again, when that algae dies, it is decomposed by the bacteria, but those bacteria are pulling oxygen out of the water to do their decomposition work. And that's where you lose a lot of oxygen and then fish die off. So cultural eutrophication is human-caused input of nutrients. Eutrophication can exist without human inputs, but nowadays really what we're seeing is human or cultural eutrophication. So here's another picture just showing how a oligotrophic lake will have fewer fish. It doesn't have as many plants to support the food chain, basically. And then a eutrophic lake has too many plants, too many producers, and it can actually pull the oxygen out of the water as well as block sunlight from reaching deeper zones. All right, so lakes do have a structure during some parts of the year that are divided by density and temperature. And throughout the year, though, they have what's called a turnover. So we'll talk about some of these different seasons here, but the summer and the winter tend to have a more layered look. Summer in particular has the 3 very different layers. And then during the fall and spring, you have what's called turnover or overturn, it can be referred to, so the layers start to mix. And the important thing about that is that oxygen from the surface can be brought to the bottom where organisms need it. And then nutrients from the bottom are brought back up to the top so that the producers can can make food from those nutrients using sunlight. So the temperature and density differences are what causes it to either stay in place or to circulate. So the temperature is much warmer in the summer on the top than it is on the bottom, and this makes it much less dense. And the colder, denser water falls to the bottom. Now, when that starts to shift during the fall and the spring, that's when you start to see the water move because it's getting more dense. And then down here, that water replaces the more dense water and lifts up. So it's all temperature and density. Summer, again, this is when the sunlight penetrates the surface and it makes it much less dense. In the fall, the falling temperature causes the fall turnover here. So you have a decrease in the temperature, and that decreased temperature of the surface water actually increases the temperature. Cold water is more dense than warm water. So that cold water becomes more dense, and that causes that water to sink. And then that water has to then move up. The water from the bottom moves up to replace it, and that's when you start that turnover, that fall turnover. So uniform temperatures then occur throughout the surface or throughout the entire depth of the lake. Now, in the wintertime, the surface waters cool and then they form ice on the top. And one of the really cool things about ice is it is less dense than water. So most substances on Earth, the solid form is more dense than the liquid form and it will sink. But ice is this really cool substance that we have here, and that's why it's so important for life. And it freezes and floats when it's colder, when it's solid. And this actually insulates the lake below it and allows the life forms to survive. If ice were actually to sink, like most materials on Earth and in the universe, then organisms couldn't survive in the water over the winter. So this ice cap on the surface is actually really important to insulate the organisms within the lake. In springtime, turnover happens again. So you have the changing in densities of the water, and the water actually moves and becomes uniform again, just like it did in the fall. So this is essentially how nutrients get to the surface where they wouldn't otherwise do that, and warmer water gets to the bottom and dissolved oxygen gets to the bottom. This is just showing a picture of how that layer kind of moves in the summer all the way into the early fall. Then you have the turnover, winter, and then fall turnover again, and then start back over. So here's another picture showing that stratification. There's official terms for it, not super important to remember the names of the terms. Just know that in the fall and in the spring, it turns over as a result of temperature and density differences. All right, on to our moving systems of fresh water. These are flowing water ecosystems or lotic systems. They have zones themselves, and it all has to do with how close they are to the source. So the source or the headwaters is where the water is either provided by spring water or by rain or by precipitation. The transition zone is what we're actually usually familiar with, which is just like the stream or the river that goes through the land. And then the floodplain is closer to the mouth of the river or stream, where it's going out either into a larger body of water, of flowing water, or into the ocean. So let's talk about each one of these areas specifically. Now, the cool thing about water is that it's actually moving from the force of gravity. So gravity is just pulling the water from the tops of higher elevation areas, whether it's mountains or even just a higher elevation like from where we are. That water is flowing under the force of gravity. At the surface, or at the very top, the source, the water is more shallow, it's colder, and it's faster because it's got that force of gravity pulling down on it. And then there's a lot of high dissolved oxygen because of that flowing water and that continuous source, the water coming into the flowing system. Now, something to think about with dams in particular, dams are usually built in areas with higher elevation because it provides that gravity for the falling water to turn a turbine and create hydroelectric power. But what dams also do is limit the amount of nutrients that can get down to the farther down ecosystems that need those nutrients. So that's one of the things that's important to know about the construction of dams, is that while it's good for making hydroelectric power, which is a good thing, doesn't release carbon, you are actually preventing nutrients from getting farther downstream into the transition zone and into the floodplain. So in the transition zone here, you have a wider stream basin, or wider basin. It's deeper. It's a little bit slower because the gravity is further, or it's still pulling it towards the ocean or to the larger body of water, but you don't have as much gravity, as much elevation to do that. It slows down, and it has lower dissolved oxygen because it's slowing down. And then the final place where it's either going out into the ocean or into a larger body of water or larger river is the floodplain. So this is the widest, the slowest, and it has the lowest dissolved oxygen. So it could be flowing into a lake, could be flowing into the ocean, could be flowing into a larger stream. So there's lots of little tiny streams you might notice throughout Westerville. They are all flowing into Alum Creek or Big Walnut Creek. Those are bigger bodies of water. And those rivers eventually reach out into the Ohio River. The Ohio River then goes to the Mississippi River, and then the Mississippi River eventually goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So all this water, again, it's flowing to those locations by the force of gravity. Isn't that so crazy? So cool. If you take a look at this picture here, it's showing sediment being deposited here. But just a reminder, again, dams, if there's dams built up further stream, you're going to limit that amount of sediment that gets down to the ocean. So you're going to limit the amount of sediment that gets to plants and producers that need it, not only in the ocean, but farther upstream as well. So here is the picture of the entire water system, the source zone, transition zone, and the floodplain zone. And here we are at our next pit stop. What causes rivers and streams to flow to the ocean? Take a moment, pause the video while you answer the question. Our next category of freshwater ecosystems are marshes and swamps. Definitions of the two vary, but it basically is shallow water for at least part of the year. A lot of times it'll be waterlogged, but then it also has dry periods as well. Now, these are anaerobic areas, so there's not as much oxygen. However, they do have a lot of organic materials. You almost think of like the smelly, stinky swamp, one that's just been sitting there decomposing. That's kind of the smell of an anaerobic environment like this. And this is the type of environment that forms coal. And over millions of years, when all of that organic material gets compressed, it forms coal. And so that's where we got our sources of coal millions of years ago, is areas like that. Now, marshes are more grass-like. They're the plant that dominates is grass. And in swamps, you have trees and shrubs that dominate. Both cases, they do have a waterlogged system. This, I believe, is cypress trees, possibly. There are cypress trees actually up at Highlands Park, which I always mention because I live close by to there. But they have a swamp-like attribute to them, those cypress trees. Now, wetlands are extremely important to filtering out pollutants, to wildlife habitat, to help control flooding. In fact, once again, the Highlands Park wetlands were built to help with all of these measures. So they control the flooding in the area. They also help with pollution in the area from pollution coming off of the streets. Instead of going directly into the Alum Creek or Big Walnut Creek, those pollutants are kind of filtered out in the Highlands Park wetlands. There's also a groundwater recharge area associated with wetlands, and all that means is that water is able to slowly sink into the ground rather than rushing out over the surface into the bigger stream. So it helps with a lot of ecosystem services and economic services that we need, but it's also very good for plants, migratory birds, and other types of biodiversity as well. So freshwater inland wetlands are basically sponges. And again, this is cypress trees. You see the roots kind of growing up here. That helps them during the super wet times. to take in some of that moisture. But they act like natural sponges, just taking in water. And then again, it provides a lot of wildlife habitat. Lots of organisms can live in those areas. So a lot of places are building wetlands in order to help with not only pollution, but build up water storage facility, I guess you could call it. If you guys are ever able to check out the wetlands over at Highlands Park after a big rain, it's really cool to see when you look in the water. There's pollution there that you can see oil, you can see goldfish sometimes, but there's lots of things that it kind of helps to filter out before it goes into Allen Creek or Big Walnut Creek. So they filter and degrade pollutants. They reduce flooding and erosion by absorbing some of the water that would normally just rush across the surface. They help replenish the stream flows during dry periods because they have a kind of a reserve in the back, holding back, that goes into those streams when water is needed. They recharge ground aquifers. An aquifer is just a storage rock, almost like a rock with holes in it, and it stores water. So those wetlands can help slowly let the water go back down into the ground. Once again, it prevents it from rushing across the surface and away from the area. And they provide economic resources and recreation. You can go take a walk in a wetland area, and it's a very beautiful and serene experience. Let me go back there and leave that up for a moment. So it serves us not only economically, environmentally, but also it makes us feel good to go walk around in a wetland area. And it helps our wildlife as well. Now, humans, of course, we cause a lot of environmental damage. Fragmentation is when you split up an ecosystem or fragment an ecosystem. So dams, diversions, or canals, they can all take the water away from what a natural ecosystem would have. Flood control levees and dikes can help or destroy aquatic habitats or move things where they shouldn't be. The elimination of wetlands is a very big problem for all the reasons that we stated wetlands are important. The Ohio EPA actually requires that if an organization destroys an area of wetland, they have to build wetlands in a different location. Battelle Darby Creek Metro Park, which we may go on a field trip in the spring, we'll see. They actually have a huge wetland area that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of companies building in areas that destroy wetlands. So they have to build somewhere else to help mitigate the effect. Now, draining or filling wetlands can also destroy them and their potential to help filter things and absorb some of the water. Now, cities and farmlands add pollutants and those excess plant nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, to the streams and rivers, which leads to cultural eutrophication and then hypoxic zones. So those are an obvious negative effect of our human activities. I'll leave this up here for just a moment. Now, the videos this week that we'll be watching will also help to explain that process of cultural eutrophication and how that turns into hypoxic zones or dead zones. Those are two particularly important concepts for you to know for the AP exam. All right, so here we are at the summary section. Read through your notes again from the very beginning and write a 10-sentence summary about the important topics related to aquatic ecosystems.